started. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Camee Maddox-Wingfield, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. Dr. Maddox-Wingfield received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Florida in 2015. As a cultural anthropologist, Dr. Maddox-Wingfield's research interests center on cultural activism and identity formation in Caribbean and African diaspora dance communities, with a primary focus on the French Caribbean. She is especially interested in the various ways that dance expression intersects with cultural politics, spirituality, and healing in communities suffering from colonial and/or racial oppression. Her work also explores the ways in which dance becomes an expression of protest, resistance, and solidarity. Dr. Maddox-Wingfield is currently working on a book project that is tentatively titled Rhythmic Consolation: Ballet's Rebirth in Contemporary Martinique. The book interrogates the cultural politics and power dynamics that shape the contemporary discourse and practice of ballet, a traditional drum dance complex in Martinique, which will be the focus of her talk today. In this work, Maddox-Wingfield situates ballet as a site for intervening in ongoing debates about non-sovereignty and the complexities of French national secularism. The book project is being developed along with a virtual exhibition that will serve as a multimedia companion to the book, promoting wider public engagement with digital scholarship on performative cultural traditions. Her research has been published in the journal Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, engaging ballet performance from Black feminist perspectives to analyze the therapeutic impact and the function of sensual expressivity in ballet for women dancers. She also contributed a chapter in a new edited volume titled Embodying Black Religions in Africa and Its Diasporas, published by Duke University Press, September 2021. Without further ado, Dr. Maddox-Wingfield. Thank you.
Wow, what a wonderful opportunity. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the kind introduction. I really appreciate you taking the time to share information about my work. I also want to thank the organizers of this Colloquium series and for the invitation and your hospitality. Thank you to the Penn Anthropology community, including the staff and faculty and the graduate students for coordinating my schedule during my visit, and other events like tonight's dinner that will hopefully make for a very memorable visit to Philadelphia. Much gratitude to Professors Lauren Risvet and Andrew Carruthers. I'm not sure if Andrew is here, but hi, nice to meet you. Much gratitude to you both for offering up this exploration of the senses, the sensorium, and giving us an opportunity to talk about different anthropological perspectives that can enrich our understandings of sense. I truly appreciate the opportunity to ruminate on this theme as it relates to my work on dance culture. And a very special thanks to Professor Deborah Thomas, who has long been an inspiration to me through much of my walk with anthropology and has played a very active role in more recent years as a mentor. So thank you so much for your generosity of time and your attentive consideration of my ideas. Thank you for all you've done to advance Caribbeanist anthropology and the study of Black diaspora in anthropology. So thank you so much for influencing my thinking. So the title of my talk is Curators of Sacred Space, toward an Anthropology of Ambiance and the Study of Black Life. So yes, today I want to talk to you all about ambiance. I want to probe questions related to ambiance in the context of my research on the ballet drum dance culture of Martinique in order to work through or to begin the process of untangling the complexities of spirituality and cultural politics in contemporary Martinique. The question of the sacred-secular binary, which is a dichotomy most of us understand to be false and misleading and problematic, but nevertheless, this dichotomy has haunted my thinking over the last decade plus since I began my field research as a master's student in 2009, and then subsequently for my doctoral dissertation in 2013. It has been no easy task to analytically frame the nexus of power, religion, and expressive culture that operates on the island and plays a critical role in demonstrations of protest, resistance, and refusal. And I'm still not sure that I have succeeded in this task, but today I take this as an opportunity to explore the following inquiries and interrogations. And just so you all know, this is very much a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to a generative conversation with you all where I can learn from your feedback and have you all weigh in on these ideas that I'm thinking through. So I ask, how can an anthropology of ambiance be made both politically and spiritually meaningful to our understandings of non-sovereignty, futurity, and possibility in Martinique? What can analysis of ambiance in the context of ballet spaces, such as the lighting, the nighttime skyscape, the sounds, the movement aesthetics, the tastes, the aromas, the colors, the relationship between performers and the participant audience members, what can all of these elements reveal about Martinican social processes of healing and repair? What kinds of embodied forms and kinesthetic processes are produced and mediated by the ambiance of ballet spaces? What kinds of ambiance are created by the embodied forms of communal dance, drum, and song? Hang in there with me, I have a number of interrogations here that will guide my thinking. What can we glean when we view ballet actors as ambiance makers, as curators of sacred space? And what can the ballet ambiance tell us about Black Antillean social worlds and sensibilities? So thinking about dancing on that line that supposedly divides the sacred and the secular in colonial spaces like Martinique, how does this shape Black Antillean social worlds today? And what can ballet actors and organizers tell us about the cultural and aesthetic sensibilities of Black Antillean life? I'm interested in the material and embodied practices that make the ballet ambiance legible. And for whom is the ballet ambiance legible? To what end and to what degree does one need to make the ballet ambiance legible? And lastly, can we look at the question of racialization in the study of ambiance when we analyze the tensions of French public laïcité, also known as the national ideology of secularism in France, with Black Antillean spiritual practices and religious identities, and their links with plantation histories and diaspora and Atlantic world processes. So in my discussion today, I'll begin with an overview that describes the cultural, geopolitical, and psychosocial realities of Martinique that have taken shape through the prolonged processes of colonization, departmentalization, which is the term that's used to describe integration with the French state as a strategy for decolonizing, the assimilation that came with departmentalization, and the ongoing dependency on French imperialist configurations and institutions under late liberalism. And I'm thinking here with Paganelli's critique of liberalism that she terms late liberalism as it pertains to France's biopolitical reach in the French Antilles. There's been work done on the systematic poisoning of chlordicone and the toxicity, particularly by anthropologist Vanessa Agard-Jones, who takes up these issues. Also thinking about France's regulating of multiculturalism and secularist ideals and discourses that create a contentious relationship between the metropole and its overseas territories. Right? I'm also going to provide an overview of ballet, the dance tradition that I study from past to present, to historically contextualize the significance of the recent revitalization movement. And right now, some ballet actors refer to this current moment as a post-revival moment because the revival took place through much of the late 80s and early 90s. And so today's generation of activists now refer to this moment as a post-revival moment. But it's important to first describe how ballet was conceptualized during the revival movement after years of eclipse and basically it being dissolved from Martinique's cultural landscape as a result of assimilation. So in that section, I want to introduce the three key modes of spiritual engagement that I now find in the contemporary ballet practice and discourse that inform my thinking about the simultaneous refusal of and confluence with French laïcité among Antillians of African descent. I also want to present ambiance as an analytic to the anthropology of the senses and a mode of understanding Black life, or what Kevin Kwashi terms Black aliveness and Black world making. With Belle Ambiance at the center of my analysis, I ruminate alongside the interdisciplinary voices in Black studies, literary, art, and performance studies, and I try to locate a point of intervention in anthropological debates on religion, spirituality, and secularity. I'm also engaging with perspectives around how we deal with archives, for example, thinking about Saidiya Hartman and Jackie Alexander on Pedagogies of the Crossing, Jennifer Sharp on immaterial archives, and of course Deb Thomas. Deb Thomas's work on political life in the wake of the plantation. All of these perspectives have been instructive in the task of unsettling our engagement with archives as authoritative modes of knowledge production by revealing the limitations, violences, and omissions of official, colonial, and state records. And if there's time at the end, because I know I have a number of tasks at hand, I will conclude with a discussion of Catherine Dunham's brief experience in 1930s Martinique, which I am attempting to frame as a Black feminist pursuit of reconciliation and a form of ancestral care work, a way of attending to an intellectual genealogy that has created so many possibilities for how we think about Blackness and performance. And I've experimented with these ideas in the past as kind of a dance offering. For example, I presented part of this work at AAA a couple of years ago where I integrated multimodal images and live dance performance as a way of thinking through a cross-temporal dialogue with Catherine Dunham. So I'm looking at this as a sort of multimodal presentation that encourages a cross-temporal dialogue with anthropological predecessors who took unconventional routes using the tools of anthropology, in part due to the barriers of institutional racism that shaped the moment of their careers. For example, Catherine Dunham and Zora Neale Hurston. So I present these ideas today as a way of developing the introductory chapter of my book project that's currently in progress. As was mentioned in the introduction, tentatively titled Rhythmic Consolation, Belle's Rebirth in Contemporary Martinique. And this is a working title that I'm still kind of playing around with. But I'm thinking about these ideas today and using this opportunity today to think about outlining a theoretical framework and a Black studies-informed method of interpretation for my book's introduction. So first, some discussion of Martinique and the ballet drum dance context. I'll be partly reading, partly just kind of summarizing and describing for you all. What you have here is an image of two dancers dancing the Belia during the 20 de Mai celebrations. May 22nd is Emancipation Day in Martinique, and so there are annual observances on May 22nd with ballet performed in different parts of the island. But this is one of the more popular events that takes place in the capital city of Fort-de-France. And the way people describe this event and this experience, which I've had the benefit of going back to each year, up until COVID, unfortunately, I was going back to Martinique each summer to observe the 20 de Mai celebrations, and even after my dissertation field work. Each year, this event becomes more and more packed, more and more crowded. You see more and more flags with the radical colors that symbolize a cultural nationalism of the red, black, and green, and the different symbolic interpretations that are applied to those colors as it relates to the ancestral past, and ideas around marronage and resistance. And you see a very lively display of what Martiniquans describe as escaping to a different world once they enter these spaces, right? This transcendence to another dimension. It's the lighting, it's the sound, it's the placement of this venue near the sea that people describe as being a uniquely special in this context. It's the food that's served. They always serve the traditional dish of tinen amaru, which is saltfish and plantains. And so all of these elements come together to make this a very unique annual event for ballet practitioners. This is another photo of that event, as you can see here. So first, again, some context about the geopolitical, cultural, and social realities of Martinique. Martinique is an overseas territory of France located in the Lesser Antilles and has been characterized by both scholars and local inhabitants over the past century as an island of post-colonial schizophrenia, and I use that term quoting William Miles, who's a political scientist, madness and distress, thinking about the work of Raymond Massé, Richard Price, the ways in which they describe kind of the psychosocial impacts of assimilation in Martinique. And much of this characterization has been framed by Martinique's ongoing subordination to and dependency on France, which is understood by many to be a form of structural violence or structural cause of emotional suffering among island residents. As a non-independent island society of the Caribbean that has fully integrated with its former colonial power, which they call it Département d'Outre-mer, an overseas department, with its large concentration of African descendants, Martinique has witnessed its share of struggles around the political, economic, and cultural costs of assimilation. Some of Martinique's most prominent intellectuals of the mid-20th century offer timeless critical commentary on the post-colonial tensions of cultural identity and political subjection. Take Martinican psychiatrist and phenomenologist, for example, Frantz Fanon, whose ideas on the intersections of colonization, race, and psychopathology continue to be cited widely today, or Aimé Césaire and Edward Glissant, who each grieved what they observed as, quote, cultural genocide and genocide by substitution in describing the realities of assimilation in post-colonial Martinique. So they became an overseas department in 1946. Aimé Césaire actually led the charge on seeing Martinique's decolonization, the best strategy for decolonization being that of integrating with the French state as a way of undoing the harms of the past and trying to get on the path to equality with French national citizens. Of course, this was a perspective that went on to be critiqued in the years that followed by activists and people advocating for independence in Martinique. But with French citizenship comes the voting rights and representation in the French Parliament, Social Security, and public services. Again, just to highlight some of the quotes that have come from the intellectuals in Martinique, that came from Martinique: genocide by substitution, cultural genocide, the native schizophrenia and psychopathology of colonial oppression. William Miles describing it as the schizophrenic island in A Paradox in Paradise, right? And Détresse Créole by Raymond Mancet, who's a medical anthropologist that looks at idioms of distress and wellness in the Martinican context. So oftentimes people cite their frustrations with the high cost of living in Martinique, which is the result of imported consumer goods that they have to deal with price inflation and the difficulties of purchasing simple basic goods. For example, a tube of toothpaste in Martinique costs 3 times more than what it would in Paris. The low wages that make it difficult to keep up with the high cost of living, the racialized division of labor, political subordination, and all of these things also contribute to crises of identity and feelings of social suffering in terms of them trying to grapple with what it means to be both Black and French, what it means to be both Antillean and citizens of the French state, where rights are unevenly applied or seem to be unevenly applied. So they cite feelings of insecurity, dispossession, vulnerability, and alienation, and work by epidemiologists and medical anthropologists cite the high rates of depression, generalized anxiety, mood disorders, and incidents of suicide that seem to be the results of these crises of identity and emotional and social suffering. Right. So one site of cultural struggle has been the ballet drum dance revival. This is a social movement that emerged, like I said, in the late 1980s. And that is the subject of my book project. So the ballet organizations across Martinique is where I mostly immersed myself during field work. I went to dance classes over the course of my PhD dissertation field work, which was duration 18 months. I spent about 4 to 5 days a week going to dance classes in different parts of the island, participating as a dancer, recording public dance events and rituals, and then using video recordings in video elicitation interviews to interview people. And oftentimes people's commentary on how I danced actually generated new research questions or answered questions that I already had in place in terms of how they framed my belonging to a diaspora that they have a shared community with, and overlapping Black cultural sensibilities that they saw I was able to decipher and make legible, but then also the limitations of my Americanness. And so sometimes these conversations really spoke to what the Black Antillean sensibility looked like and helped to guide my research questions about identity and belonging. right? And so just to give a sense of what ballet is, in contemporary Martinique, ballet is not merely the name of an ancestral dance practice. The term ballet is used to delineate a way of life, or manière vivre, as they say in Creole, a subculture that is organized around a rich complex of Afro-Creole dance traditions, all of which are performed to the island's tambour ballet, which is the ballet drum. Right? And what you see in ballet is the quadrille-based choreography of 8 dancers, right? They're doing square dance configurations. It's a partner kind of courting dance that has some of its origins in the French ballroom culture that emerged in colonial era Martinique when French colonial residents in Martinique had nostalgia for the trending dances and events going on in Paris, and would have master teachers come over to Martinique and teach them and their families the quadrille dances. But what it integrates is an African-based footwork, gestures, bodily orientation, and Afro-Creole aesthetic sensibilities, right? So in the French quadrille, you have a very erect, upright body orientation in terms of, and a lot of kind of regulation and control over how you interact with your partner. But in ballet, you have a flat-footed impact with the ground. You're dancing barefoot to have direct flesh contact with the ground. You have a bent body orientation, very dynamic movements, and the flirtatious interplay between dancers is much more explicit than what you would see in the quadrille, right? And the soirée ballet gatherings are the primary performance contexts where you see groups gathering in kind of a grassroots organized way. So these aren't performative venues. These aren't venues that are intended for performing for tourists. These are very much grassroots organized by cultural activists and organizations that function through an annual calendar of when they'll host events in different parts of the island. Right, and so it's not for entertainment, it's actually very, very personal reasons why people get involved in this, and to socialize with like-minded people who often share their kind of political perspectives and larger worldview about Martinique's place in the world. So I just want to quickly show a video of what the quadrille looks like so you can get a sense of what the square dancing kind of origins of the ballet look like. I don't know if I have sound. I probably should have checked that before, but But this does give you a sense of what the kind of partner square dancing formation looks like in the French quadrille. And then the ballet, which I'll have to fast forward a little bit, this is a bit long, but the ballet opens with a circular procession where they go into a half circle and then they reverse the procession. So they start off by going in a counterclockwise direction and then they return to their original spots. And they break into the square dancing formations of 4 dancers at a time. Oftentimes these events are held in open air markets or in kind of wooded areas where they've created dance spaces on the kind of bare earth using, kind of a packed soil flooring, because there are some spiritual reasons for having direct contact with the spirits of the earth, which is only a recently emerging discourse among activists that people weren't talking as much about 10 to 15 years ago. But if not on the bare ground, they are dancing on wooden planks that are constructed specifically for ballet events. In other words, they say you should dance on tile, you shouldn't be dancing on cement, you should be having direct contact with a natural element, be it the soil or wood, right? And so, again, you see the 4 dancers, and then after each of the squares dance, each couple takes a turn of interacting in flirtatious display, where they have a flirtatious exchange, and a lot of times it's a game of pursuit and retreat between the male and female dance partner. I've written about this in the Meridians article about how the women dancers kind of hold a certain erotic authority over the experience and the outcome in their sensual engagement with their male partners. And they also use this as an opportunity to salute the musicians as they dance towards them and offer them a greeting or dance greeting of salutation to thank them for providing the music. All right. Again, just to highlight my methodology is based on 24 months of cumulative field research, the majority of which took place between 2013 and 2014, and I've gone back each summer up until summer of 2019. Embodied data collection using my body as a tool for eliciting responses in terms of the commentary on the people dancing around me and with me, my dance interactions with people. Of course, I relied on open-ended and semi-structured interviews, focus group interviews, life history interviews, and I use, like I said, to an extent, video and photo elicitation interviewing methods. So I often like to highlight why the relevance of questions of the sacred and spirituality in Martinique, because so much of the work that's already been done on Martinique comes from secular perspectives, and I think I have some ideas around why this might be the case. So previous scholarship on ballet highlighted as a new social movement for kind of refashioning political and economic sensibilities and igniting protests among activists. They studied it as the revival as a strategy for defending the island's cultural heritage against the exploitative touristic representations that you see in certain sites. And they looked at ballet as a space for creating a renewed sense of belonging, right? And so these are very important analyses of what the ballet revival looks like in the early 90s, early 2000s, and through the 90s and into the early 2000s. I do notice in my own research that since about 2009, there's been a significant shift in how people perceive the function of ballet that includes much more elements around spirituality and questions of the sacred that were not explicit at the time that these other researchers were working there. And I've even in conversation with other scholars, they've said, well, occasionally people would mention spirituality, but I just kind of dismissed it as a new agey discourse because I didn't think it was, relevant to the questions I had at the time. So I think that 2009, which was a time in which a huge period of political unrest erupted in Martinique and Guadeloupe. You all may be familiar with the work of Yarima Bonilla, who's worked on the strikes in Guadeloupe. 2009 was a huge turning point in terms of marking the disillusionment and disenchantment of French Antillians after a 42-day period of strike, suspended economic activity. Island residents waited to see what change would come from that, right? And so there was this kind of sense of disillusionment that if there's not a viable path of political transformation, what other ways can we look to renegotiate the terms of our relationship with France? And I think ballet is a site for analyzing those questions, but it was also during this time that different spiritual interpretations began to emerge, and they became much more visible in terms of material artifacts and things that were present at ballet gatherings that referenced the diasporic cosmologies of Black Atlantic religion. You saw the production of gospel ballet music and gospel ballet concerts being put on from the Catholic perspective. And so these things really started to take hold after that 2009 moment of political unrest. Ballet is honored by practitioners as an earth dance or a dance of the land that reinforces human connections with the land and human fertility, the life sources, right? So they look to the soil, the waterways, and the vegetation on which the enslaved ancestors labored and survived, right? Through much of ballet's revival movement that began in the mid-1980s by a group of young, radical, anti-colonial activists, the tradition was understood and taught as a secular, non-religious practice. However, an evolving discourse has emerged among ballet community members over its spiritual and affective functions in the everyday lives of practitioners. In my research, I've been interested in interrogating the broader power dynamics and social processes that have influenced this shift in perception. by examining the cultural politics of non-sovereignty, secularism, and the various orientations of spirituality that are at work in contemporary ballet. My research demonstrates that practitioners and activists have transformed the meaning of ballet from that of a heritage valorization project to one of individual and collective healing functions, a process through which Martinicans renegotiate the terms of their relationship to France and Black diasporic communities. I draw attention to ballet communities members' accounts that speak to cosmic experience, ancestor veneration, and sacred land stewardship, notions that facilitate emotional transcendence, holistic well-being, and coping with the deleterious psychic effects of Atlantic world processes, namely the racialized and gendered forms of exploitation and abuse that have long been embedded in the political and economic configurations of colonialism, slavery, post-colonial assimilation, and neoliberal austerity measures. All right, so what I have here are the three different kind of sites of spiritual interpretation and spiritual orientation where I locate this emerging discourse in my field research. So you have some ballet practitioners, dancers, drummers, and singers who reference the diasporic cosmologies and the pantheons of spirits that make up the Haitian Vodou religion, Cuban Bukuni or Santeria, and Brazilian Candomblé, right? So those African-inspired, Yoruba and Congo-derived pantheons of spirits that are very much present and alive in the practices of other diasporic communities, but whose presence, if it ever existed in Martinique, certainly has been erased and eradicated through the intense pressures of assimilation with France. And so there's kind of this diasporic longing to connect to the diasporic religious heritage of other parts of the Caribbean, other parts of the Black Atlantic, to make up for what seems to be a lack of spiritual authenticity in Martinique. Another perspective that you find in the ballet community is that among Catholic churchgoers who have sought to refashion the Catholic liturgy with Afro-Martinican references such as ballet. So the tension with that is that they're using the drum and putting the drum, which was once an object of conflict for the Catholic Church and the French colonizers, where the drum was prohibited in certain settings, many public settings. They did not allow the enslaved to publicly gather and drum in many contexts, and it certainly didn't have a place in the church because it was seen as devilish or something that was aligned with demonic forces and superstition. And so these eradication campaigns that came with the intense conversion and assimilation of the Catholic Church prohibited the drum. And so today you have Catholics in Martinique that are like, bring the drum to church, right? Let's remake our Catholic hymns with Creole lyrical content based on the music styles of ballet. Let's develop praise dance practices that use the bodily movement styles that come from ballet, but it in a way sanitizes it so that it's appropriate for and palatable for churchgoers, right? And then somewhere within these perspectives, you have a group of people who believe ballet as a laïque spirituality or secular spirituality, a source of healing, self-preservation, and community belonging. And the people who espouse this perspective are largely made up of those activists of the 1980s who first started the revival movement. Many of them were not interested in religion and spirituality at the time of the revival because they were more focused on politicizing the dance and using it for protest. And many of them were influenced by the kind of Marxist ideals under which they learned about the problems associated with colonialism during their studies in Paris, right? So they went to university in Paris, they came back to Martinique with this kind of radicalized mission to culturalize their anti-colonial politics, and they had very atheist kind of orientations to their engagement with ballet, so they weren't interested in religion and spirituality. Now that there seems to be a demand to spiritually connect with the energies of nature and the ancestral spirits that they engage with in ballet performance settings, these same activists now talk about ballet being a secular spirituality, right? And that has definitely has resonances from the French nationalist ideas of laïcité that attempt to constrain public displays and expressions of religion, right? That we normally see in the context and contentions with Islam. So those are the three different sites of spiritual engagement that I'm interested in interrogating in my work. And the 2016 Ballet Festival was a huge turning point that I'm arguing about in the book, because during my field research, the annual Ballet Festival was just called that, the Ballet Festival, right? In 2016, they renamed the festival Ballet Juba. And when I asked about the meaning of the term Juba, they relied on, again, Haitian Vodou interpretations of Juba that you find in the sacred dance expressions of the Loa, the spirit of agriculture in Haitian Vodou, Azaka, right? The dance that they perform for Azaka and Haitian Vodou rituals is called Juba, and it's an agriculturally oriented dance, much like what you see in Martinique and Ballet, where many of the movements reflect machetes being used to cut down cane and other types of agricultural labor. And so, sorry, I don't know what that is. And so I saw that 2016 was a moment where they renamed the festival. They're relying on a vocabulary and set of symbols that come from Haitian Vodou, and they even found connections to the fact that the drum that's used to play the Juba in Haiti is called the Martinique drum. And so that definitely points to kind of an inter-island circulation of expressions and practices and ideas that surely would have circulated through the slave trade and through the era of colonization. So what does it mean, right? What is the significance of renaming a festival using this religious lexicon that's rooted in the practice of Haitian Vodou, and also thinking through some of the aesthetics that are commonly associated with Haitian Vodou. If there's time during the Q&A, I'll come back to these videos, but this is a recording of the, this is a still image of the Aunt Cafard Memorial statue. I think my computer's freezing up, oh no. This is a slave memorial that one finds in the south of Martinique, where historically a slave ship capsized and all of the people who were held in bondage on that ship drowned. And so these statues were erected in Anse Cafard of Martinique as a way of memorializing those who lost their lives during this tragedy. So they decided to have their opening ceremony of the 4-day festival at this site, and you saw, torches and plant offerings being installed in the ground to honor the divinities of the earth. They walked to the shoreline and threw fruit into the ocean as a way of saluting the deities of the ocean waters. With a food offering. And so I was stunned because I had just been there the year before for field work and none of this was happening, right? It was just a regular 4-day festival. So they renamed the festival and then they inserted these rituals that were symbolic of Black Atlantic religious practice. So I'm having a problem here with my computer freezing. So until I can figure out what's going on with that, I will just keep reading because I know we're about to, I want to wrap up knowing that we're about to go to Q&A. So this work will explore the ways in which actors in the ballet community use their bodies, particularly through the performative modalities of communal dance, movement, and music making, to curate sacred spaces and formulate new political subjectivities. Therefore, this project contributes to social science theories of embodiment and cultural politics, areas of scholarship that have been in large part shaped by Black feminist voices in anthropology, right? And so I also want to briefly mention that because this is the first full-length ethnography to explore the interrelationship between ballet performance and affect and spirituality in Martinique, it's important to highlight what some may see as kind of an omission from the scholarship. So it's important, I always restate this when I'm talking about my research. I'm not suggesting that scholars have simply ignored Martinique or excluded ballet from this important body of research. This is a relatively recent and evolving trend that has developed slowly subtly over this short period of time. Spirituality, religion, and secularity in ballet are now being discussed in ways that they were not 10 to 20 years ago. It is likely that because ballet is not unique to a specific religious heritage and is taught in many settings as a secular practice, it has been complicated for scholars to make sense of these sacred interpretations. And it's important for me to state that it is not my goal to validate or disprove the belief that ballet once had a sacred purpose or has a sacred purpose today. What's more important and much more interesting to analyze is why the ideas about religion and spirituality have become more conspicuous, have become more visible, have become more explicit, and how they intersect with the broader politics of non-sovereignty, as evidenced by the range of perspectives that I consider in the work, right? And so, this project adds to the robust body of scholarship on the anthropology of religion by intervening in debates around French national laïcité that have largely excluded the French Antillean perspective. The existing scholarship on laïcité typically focuses on the contested nature of Islam in France. Here I'm thinking about Mahmoud, Charles Hirschkind, Talal Assad. They don't address issues of racialization and the afterlife of Atlantic world processes like colonialism and slavery, which makes the French Antilles a key site for interrogating these issues. Rarely do we consider how the demands to embrace secularism as an emblem of French national identity shape the discourse and practice of Antillians living in France's overseas departments. Right? Talal Assad's work advises that anthropology of secularism should start asking how different sensibilities, attitudes, assumptions, and behaviors come together to either support or undermine the doctrines of secularism. So what we gain from my research is a deeper understanding of Martinique's asymmetrical relationships with France, the Caribbean, and the wider African diaspora. I'm also returning back to this question of ambiance, right? How might these concerns be related to the anthropology of the sensorium, the theme of this colloquium series, and furthermore, this interrogation with ambiance, right? I'm thinking about anthropologist Matthew Engelke's work on ambient faith in Swindon, which recognizes the sensual and material aspects of communicative channels, modes of sociality, and imaginings of community. In particular, he looks at Christmas angel displays and socializing in coffee houses to show how public religion gets constituted through the ambiance of certain settings in public life, right? He says, ambiance is akin to what anthropologists have often called context, which is itself indexed to the more general notion of culture. But what I want to distinguish is ambiance from context. For one thing, ambiance often conveys a more distinct sense of what is in the background, especially in acoustical terms, right? Normally we think about ambient sound. So when one has a romantic candlelit dinner complete with violin music, one says the ambiance is right, not the context is right. Right? I'm quoting Engelke here. Equally, it is the ambiance of the church rather than the context that inspires a contemplative mood. Ambiance is also more pertinent here than context because of the latter's historical association with matters of language. And just to paraphrase, he goes on to say, I argue here that ambiance can be a helpful concept with which to make sense of the ways in which religion can be understood and gets understood as public or private. Right? So problematizing not only the ideas of sacred and secular, but also these ideas of public practice and private practice, right? And so during my field work, I was immersed in these settings where people shared how the quality or the success of a ballet event was framed by rubrics of spiritual and affective impact. In other words, specific elements of ambiance, such as the surroundings, the floor space, the larger kind of ecological setting in terms of being in a wooded kind of bushland area that conjured up ideas around fugitivity and marronage, being set apart from the wider society, the lighting, the sound, all of these elements optimize synergy between the dancers, the drummers, the singers, and the participating audience. And this optimal synergy is a key criteria for transformative healing and cosmic experience. The reason why these multisensory elements that comprise the ballet ambiance matter is because people rely on these events to be moved, to escape, to enter otherworldly dimensions, to facilitate altered states of consciousness, to experience emotional transformation, ecstatic joy, grief, and to exercise the muscular tension that Fanon wrote about in the context of the psychic effects and the physiological effects of colonization. Put another way, people rely on these events to experience healing and repair. right? And so, again, I want to continue to think alongside Black studies perspectives in particular, such as world making, Black world making, Black aliveness, as Kevin Quashki writes about, where he talks about the cosmological arts of being as a way of imagining life, Black life beyond that of alienation, and also thinking about the capaciousness of Black world-making aesthetics, poetics, and aliveness, right? And so thinking about this idea of Black world-making aesthetics alongside an anthropology of ambiance to show how French Antillians who practice ballet are able to engage in cosmic experience, connectivity with the ancestral realm, how they challenged linear temporal ideas around Martinican progress, and what sovereignty actually should look like versus what it feels like to escape the constraints of French state institutions and the pressures that come along with assimilation. All of these ideas are expressed and played out in the discourse and practice of contemporary ballet. And as I've been able to show you all, that's been a very recent shift in just the last 10 years that I think deserves closer attention. So I think that wraps up my time talking. I've talked for a long time, and my slides stopped working, so hopefully I'll be able to get that fixed to share with you during the graduate seminar. But I think now's a good time to take Q&A. Questions? Dr. Otter.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. There were two questions that occurred to me. Given that you laid out a beautiful set of issues, but then we have time to explore them. So I wanted to tell a little bit more about, for example, how secular movement started. How is secular spirituality signaled in dance tradition? Right? That's one kind of question.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that first one?
How is secular spirituality being signaled through perceivable dance movement? What is the connection between them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one thing. But the other one is, there is the issue of how the performers are displaying both kinesic and other perceivable sounds, right? And there is the question of how the audience responds to or participates in this venture, because this strikes me as an extended event, right? Mm-hmm. And so with respect to, again, the same issue of the post-2016 idea of the emphasis on spiritual, secular spirituality, how does audience participation differ? Because you've been there many times, right? Mm-hmm. Between, say, 2008 and post-2016. So I was just hoping to get a better idea of some of the details that you were pointing to.
Sure. To answer that, I'll certainly have to kind of rely on my journey through doing field research in Martinique, because of course when I first went there in 2009, I wasn't even going there to look for questions of religion and spirituality. Everything that I read signaled the fact that this was a secular practice, that you had venues of touristic performance, right, that were more choreographed and scripted and were more for the tourist audience gaze, right? But many of the actors that I work with challenge that idea of what they call folk doudouisme, which is kind of the stereotypes of the nostalgic colonial past and these very exaggerated movements and interactions between dancers that are really intended to entertain tourists, right, that are not from Martinique. But so you have this grassroots kind of challenge and critique to these touristic performances that are certainly secular. No one's talking about religion and spirituality, these kind of entertainment venues. And also when you think about like staged, choreographed renditions that are put on by folkloric dance companies, that's another site of critique for the activists that are saying, what those performers do is kind of postcard Martinique to kind of invoke the ideas of Richard Price, where he talks about postcarding the past and this idea of museumifying Martinican culture as if it's stuck in this kind of nostalgic past. The activists that I work with say ballet is constantly evolving. It's a dynamic form. It's always open to change and influence while continuing to honor and pay homage to the ancestors and respect the underlying values of mutual aid and collectivism and things associated with kind of rural elements of community life in the colonial past, the post-colonial past, recent past. So they set themselves apart from these very secular performance venues that are intended for entertainment. They say, we're not here to entertain, we're here to have a transformative experience. We're here to participate in a consciousness raising around how to resist the effects of French assimilation and colonization. So at these events, you have tributes to Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire and other notable cultural activists and intellectuals that come from Martinique and the wider Caribbean, Pan-Africanist thinkers, right? So it's very ceremonial in that sense, but it still doesn't have explicit religious messaging and symbols. And so those very activists are the ones who will now say, this is a secular spirituality in the same way that some people perceive other bodily practices like yoga, right? They're saying it doesn't rely on a particular theology or organized religious institution. It doesn't rely on a particular supreme God, but it certainly aids in this effort of spiritual healing, social repair, etc. And they're saying it has a transformative therapeutic impact on the psyche and well-being of people who otherwise have dealt with the challenges of depression and alienation, kind of not knowing their place and sense of identity in Martinique. So there's still not explicit religious messages there, but certainly there's this idea of being spiritually transformed and healed in these settings. So outside of that perspective, though, why do you have some drummers drawing veve symbols that come from the Haitian voodoo rituals, where the veve symbols are drawn on the ground to invite the different deities and the loa, right, the spirits that come to possess the bodies of participants in Haitian voodoo? Why do you have drummers in Martinique drawing those veve on their drums? And one particular drummer drew it in red and white, and when I asked him why he chose those those colors, he said, Shango, the Orisha, the warrior Orisha spirit of the Yoruba pantheon of spirits, he's my Orisha, right? And so, but this is someone who's Martinican, who has not been formally initiated in the Yoruba-derived practices of Santeria and Candomblé, but certainly has inspiration from the symbology of voodoo, the symbology of the Orishas. Another participant who said the reason why it's important to dance on the bare kind of earth, right, the soil, with your bare feet, direct contact with the ground, is so the Juba spirits that live in the earth. And we know that Juba is associated with Kuzin Azaka and Haitian Voodoo, who is the spiritual minister of agriculture, right, and who's the spirit of the peasants and the farmers who work the land, right? And so you have these different interpretations of both secular spirituality and explicit references to Afro-Atlantic religious heritage. And the reason why the Catholic Church presents an interesting conundrum is because they're all unified in this mission of reviving a cherished dance form, but historically the Catholic Church is the very institution that repressed the practice and said no drums allowed, right? Participated in these eradication campaigns. So certainly those who kind of take the anti-dogmatic stance of both secularism and those invested in kind of the Afro-Atlantic religious connections, they're saying, why are you giving our cherished tradition to the Catholic Church? In a sense, they're saying, why are we practicing something that was once repressed by Catholicism in Catholic settings? But for those who advocate for it, they're saying it's a way of appealing to Catholic churchgoers who have otherwise been dismissive of our local traditional practices, right? It's inviting them to engage in an experience that they were raised to reject and to ignore and to not participate in because it was associated with primitive, which I put in quotes, kind of rural life and the backwards traditions that they associated with rural workers, right? And so all of these stereotypes that have really helped kind of stigmatize participation in ballet. Now Catholic churchgoers are opening up to the practice because they're seeing liturgical dance being refashioned through movement styles that are inspired by the basic footwork and arm movements that you find in ballet, right? So an example of this is there's a sensual interplay between the male and female dancers where she's winding her hips, she's opening her arms to him, she's going to decide if she's going to accept his pursuit and embrace him or reject him. So there's this very kind of flirtatious and sensual exchange. that's called bote, where the hips are moving and there's kind of this isolation of hip pelvic rotation. But then they've reformatted, in a sense, this very movement in church, so that instead of opening up to a potential mate, you're opening your arms up to God, doing the same exact movement with your foot, right? But you're dancing towards the altar and doing this to signify, opening up to the supreme God, right? So this presents a conflict and a tension within this community of activists that are saying, certainly there are spiritual elements in the dance, but I don't think anybody's trying to prove one perspective over the other. You just have some who are not interested in the kind of institutionalization of the church, and even the French national education system that has now created a PE program around ballet, where students can take the ballet elective and get PE credit for it, but the people who come and assess them are French PE teachers, right, who come to Martinique and sit on this jury to say whether or not the students pass their ballet exam. And so there are these questions around the institutionalization of ballet and how that kind of sanitizes it and removes those kind of innate spiritual sensibilities that you find in these other perspectives. And so, like I said, I didn't go to Martinique looking for religion and spirituality because no one else had been talking about it in that way before the 2009 moment. So.
Dr. Thomas, I think I saw you first. Seems like there are a lot of questions.
This, I think, also develops a little of what Asif was asking in terms of, in the movement, how do you see the spirituality or the secular spirituality? And, but via different routes. So I'm interested in the relation you're setting up between context and ambiance. And because that lovely image stayed on so long of the statues lit at night, I'm assuming that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah. They were sitting on the statues with fire torches.
Right. Okay, so that image and that context produced a very different ambiance than what we saw in what looked like a studio with a marble floor.
Oh, yes, that was an open air market where the floors had been constructed just for that event.
Okay, so in the market, on the floor. So I wanted to hear you sort of talk about what those two, both the market context is more a grassroots sociality, right? And the hillside statue context is the more ceremonial in a way. But I can imagine that the way that atmosphere and ambiance would have affected people's movement structures would have been highly intense, right? And intensely different from what you would have seen in the market.
Sure.
So can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's not insignificant that they decided to do it on that hillside.
Right.
And I think it produces something else that you're getting at. So I just would love to hear you say more about that.
Sure, I was able through, by attending, again, these weekly Saturday night soiree ballet that were in different contexts, some of them more ceremonial than others, right? Some of them were just kind of like, okay, we're gathering for a soiree ballet at this location, people come and go, there's an unscripted rotation of dancers, and it's very convivial, and people are just socializing and having a good time, right? Now, I think that the fact that, there's alcohol, right? There's rum, and there's the tea punch that Martinicans drink, and it's kind of a key element of socializing in these settings. All of those aspects contribute to kind of this euphoric sense of happiness and joy that's kind of expressed in these settings, right? They're having a good time. They're using the Saturday night gathering as a way of escaping the pressures of everyday life in Martinique. But there is a particular emphasis on the lighting, right? Or on the presence of fruit offerings or an altar that's mounted for the ancestors, right? People are coming to socialize and they're still having a really kind of ecstatic experience in terms of the joy that they experience. You can hear very clear differences in how people describe certain soiree ballet with others. And sometimes, I definitely mentioned this in Meridian's article where one woman says, it's when all of the elements are right? When the lighting is right, when the singer has that rich kind of elderly, almost like an aged voice, right? With a sonorous range that really can move people and have an affect impact, right? To the point where people are brought to tears. It's when there's a lineup of one singer after the next, all of whom are very, very talented singers, right? Rather than this kind of unscripted rotation of people with different levels of, experience in the dance. So it's when all of the dancers are people who've been doing this for a long time, which they call initiated dancers, right? When the initiated singers, when the elders are present, when the acoustics of the space are right, because there are some people who put a string across their drum to change the vibrations and the frequency to enable altered states of consciousness, right? So when all of these elements come together, people describe that as a very different experience. They're saying those are the ones that give me chills. Those are the ones that I go home at night and I can't stop thinking about it, right? It's almost as if, and in the article in Meridians I write about this, she says it's almost like ballet takes the place of a husband or a lover, right? You just can't get enough of it. And she writes about these kind of orgasmic experiences that she has on the dance floor when all of the elements are right, when the drummer is in perfect harmony with the footwork of all 8 dancers. And you can feel that all 8 dancers are moving together in harmony. That's very different than someone who's been dancing for a year in the same square, someone who's been dancing for 30 years, with a singer who's still in training, right? The elements are not all going to come together and produce that kind of synergy. So I do think those ceremonial contexts where there are like intentionality of mounting the altar, of having the fire torches, of dancing around the slave memorial, and then having storytellers and spoken word poetry and all these other performative elements come together in that space that I do think produces a different type of response and reaction to people. Right? So you have this kind of social gatherings that can be fun and people talk about it as kind of the highlight of their week, but then you have these other experiences where saying, that night I escaped, I went somewhere else, or I entered a trance state, or I don't even remember, or all I know is that as I was doing my Monty au Tambour while I was saluting the drummer, I ended up crying. Some people saying, while I'm doing my Monty au Tambour, I deposit or I leave my words and I pray to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? So they're integrating all of these kind of interesting religious aspects to describe why it left such a huge emotional impact and therapeutic impact on their lives. And those events don't happen every Saturday, right? They're few and far between. Emancipation Day is another such event where people are really like, even the next morning when they're still dancing, they're like, they can't leave, right? It's like there's this addiction that they can't get enough of it. And so you can really tell differences in terms of how the context, in terms of how it's described based on these different ambiance elements. That's that answers your question.
Hi, Camee. Thank you so much for really bringing us into the way that these dancers are dancing the line between the spiritual, the secular, public, private, all that's just really intriguing. And I think this is a kind of, you're already talking about a little bit, and I just want to hear a little bit more about the way that this spiritualization, if it connects, how it connects to the spiritualization of gender relations, because it seems like a dance that has such profound implications in terms of relationality between the genders, not just of the dancers, and I don't know ballet well enough, but I presume the musicians, there's also a gender division there in terms of who plays what, and how that contributes to this overall ambiance that's getting created. And also, of course, you already answered what I wanted to know, which is what happens in a space of a Catholic church where the performance of gender has to radically change in order to...
Definitely. So, yes, one thing to note is that there's increasingly the female dancers outweigh male dancers. So at a lot of these events where you need 4 males or 4 females in one single carré, square, they often have to pair 2 female dancers together, right? It still becomes a playful exchange, but it's more like a competition of who can be more seductive, who can be more entertaining to the surrounding audience, who's going to elicit a more positive reaction in terms of clapping and applauding and kind of shouting and ad-libbing with the singer, right? So one lens could be kind of like a homoeroticizing of those interactions, because they're certainly sensual in terms of the interplay, but again, I think it's more competition driven, right? Like who can outdo the other dancer. Whereas when it's an actual male-female pairing of dancers, that the female dancer does have kind of an erotic authority over the dance outcome, right? That their goal is to seduce their male partner and then decide whether or not they're going to accept his pursuit, right? And so in those moments, right, again, referencing these Afro-Atlantic cosmologies, you have people saying that's the spirit of Oshun, right? Knowing that she's the Orisha of sensuality and fertility, and thinking about ballet as a dance of fecundity that's supposed to not only enable land fertility, but human fertility, right? And the mating of partners, and why sensuality is such a key element of those exchanges. They'll certainly say, yeah, that's like there's your lead, right? Or that's like Oshun in Santeria, those being the goddess or spirits, feminized spirits of sensuality and love and romance and all of these elements that are supposed to be on display in that interplay between the male and female dancers. So certainly for a church, again, a church setting, I've never seen a male ballet dancer in these church gatherings, right? It's usually all female lineup, and again, they're doing more movements that signify, Jesus, prayer and elements of worship to the Christian God, and relying on God for salvation, for eternal life, for protection and security. Still having that healing element, right? Because I feel protected and I feel like everything's going to be okay because I have God on my side. But instead of trying to seduce a male partner, you're really just, there's elements of piety and, I don't know, I'm just thinking about like the purity that's associated with young girls in terms of how they're raised to think about, your repressed sexuality and, the desires that are openly on display at traditional ballet gatherings. They can't be on display in these church settings, right? So it's about embracing a different kind of movement style that signals piety and chastity and purity in these ways, but still using the very same footwork, right? You're doing something different with your arms, but you're still doing that same flat-footed kind of impact to the ground, right? I also think the acoustics of the church changes the way the intensity of the way people move, because the drum doesn't produce the same sounds in a church that it would, in a kind of wooded, open-air gathering. And so I do think sometimes people are like, you can't get that same experience at church because the acoustics aren't right, or the sound is not going to be produced in the same way as in these other settings. And so, yeah, there are questions around it being sanitized and strictly codified in a way that's appropriate for church gatherings that lacks the element of improvisation and spontaneity and that flirtatious fun that comes out in these other dance gatherings. With the drum, certainly there were historically prohibitions to women drumming in the same way that you see with the bata drums and Jewish practices. Historically, women could not play the drums, and also sacred explanations for that, right, about the power of menstrual blood and why women should not sit or straddle the drum, right, because it's a way of contaminating the connection with the spirit world. And so today there are more kind of open-minded moves to welcome female drummers in drum classes, and they certainly show up at soiree ballet. Many of them just are more gravitated towards dance, and they take drum classes just as a way of better understanding the rhythms, but not necessarily to become drum masters.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious with this notion of ambiance that you're playing with, which I really like, whether you see specific attempts to draw back to the ambience of the sort of French dance that you described as being one of the origin places of particularly the sort of layout of the dancers. Like, especially thinking that I didn't think about the second half of this question until you asked yours, but particularly in thinking about how it translated into church, it seems like that's one of those places where you're sort of stripping some aspects of the ambience away and maybe taking it a little bit closer to what its origin was in the French. So I'm just curious if there's aspects of the ambience in particular that were held onto from the original French origin dance that they're also drawing on.
Sure. That's actually a really good question, and you see it more in other court dancing styles that emerge in Martinique that are, that I think became kind of a digression from the development of Martinique, right? So they have another dance practice called Potai, where the dancers are much more kind of erect and they're holding on to each other and kind of spinning in this playful way. But it's very kind of, again, ordered and regulated in terms of how you interact with the partner. The way that they dress is a lot more kind of formal, right? The man has to wear a certain, button-down shirt and, signaling the kind of formalities that we see in kind of the dance protocols of these court dances and ballroom style dances. And so there are other traditional dances that are undergoing revitalization in Martinique, but I think our ballet activists tend to distance themselves from that because it's too Europeanized, right? Or it doesn't have the same richness of Black culture and references to African origins or inspirations that one finds in kind of West African and Central African dance practices, because the movements are upright and they are bare feet and they are dressed a little more formally, and the interactions with the partners are not as intense in terms of the competition that you see and the kind of intention to seduce, right? And so there are different kind of derivatives of partner dancing that don't belong to the contemporary ballet complex, but that certainly rely on the aesthetics of some of the French ballroom style as sources of inspiration.
So I'm thinking about the idea of spirituality and perhaps like an omnipresence of spirituality in connection to this idea of ambience, and whether, are there ways that the lack of transformative experiences, are there ways that they're spoken about and conceptualized as a lack, especially if there is a reach for that transformative experience, but also it feels like there's like a layered spirituality that you're talking about because of the release of the more social gathering, like ideas of like release and stuff that are there with the more social gatherings. So so in my head I'm just thinking through about like layered spirituality, spirituality as omnipresence, as ambiance in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I think I'm still thinking through, especially with regard to kind of the lack, right? I think that's one of the words you mentioned, where there's like people have these diasporic longings because of the sense of erasure that came with French assimilation. So they'll look. This is just an example of what commonly comes up in my exchanges with people. They'll look at Haiti as kind of this example of, okay, they fought for their independence, right? They have the self-determination and sovereignty that came with the rebellious, the rebelliousness of the Haitian Revolution. They were able to fight off their French colonizers and look at this rich religious heritage that they've been able to preserve as a result of it. So they'll see what the consequences of independence looks like, right? In these nominally sovereign states where there's still ongoing dependence on imperialist formations, and Haiti being an example of economic despair that Martiniquans certainly don't have to suffer from, right? They consider the quality of life there, and the benefits that come with French citizenship is something that, we're not ready for independence because we don't want to end up like Haiti. That comes up a lot in the discourse. But look at this rich religious heritage they were able to hold on to that we have lost, right? And so I think that lack that comes through is when they see actual visuals of Haitian voodoo rituals and they see examples of spirit possession. One time I showed a video of a 1930s recording of a juba in Haiti, right? And the video was by Alan Lomax, who was working in Haiti at the time. He has this black and white video collection, and you see four dancers interacting in much the same way that you see in ballet, and you see the drummer straddled on the drum playing it the same way you see in Martinican ballet. One day when I showed that video to a ballet dancer, she said, "Oh my gosh, I just got chills. Like that is the spirit of voodoo that we don't have here, but the dance looks exactly like ours, right?" And so I think there's this longing for connecting to elements of spirituality that were kind of erased from the Martinican landscape through the repression and the eradication. But I also, like you said, I think it's the layered spirituality. The fact that people can still tap into these ideas of healing without necessarily relying on deities or without relying on the intervention of specific nature spirits and energies, right? But they do feel that there's something special, like almost like thinking about fugitivity, right? An escape from what everyday life, public life in Martinique feels like, going to a nightclub, going to a restaurant in Fort-de-France, versus going to a soirée belly on a Saturday night produces a very different experience over the weekend where, again, they go home and they're like, I still had chills when I got home, and it was just, I think the aesthetics of the space have a lot to do with that. And Aisha Beliso de Jesus writes about kind of, in the context of matanzas, with Afro-Cuban religion, how that kind of the bush and the wilderness and being out in these wooded areas, right, these bushland kind of eco-aesthetics is what really produces kind of these blackened epistemologies and experiences and feelings of emotional connectivity, right, emotional attachment to the experience of Santeria, because Matanzas being the city of kind of a rich Afro-Cuban blackness that's still very alive in the practices today. And so I do think people in Martinique may seek out events that are, at one point, and I was hoping to show the picture of this during my talk, but there is an area of Martinique in kind of a rural mountainous community where the owner of the land developed a dance space and restaurant where he created a ground, earth-packed kind of adobe flooring space for dancing, right? Because he said usually we go to soirée belly events and they have to construct these wooden, dance floor spaces because it's not safe to really dance with this kind of foot impact on tile or cement. So they have to erect these kind of platforms, and if they just come here, they can connect to the spirits of the earth, right? He'll light incense as they to purify the space for the ancestors, and he'll pour libations and do all of these things while his kind of had these palm leaf thatched roofs that cover the space, and the dance space is constructed out of bamboo stakes, and he has an outdoor kitchen where he's cooking food, and so it's very different from those kind of cosmopolitan aesthetics that you see in kind of the urban practice of ballet that's becoming more and more popular among middle class people who were raised to think that ballet was, something they should distance themselves from. And so you have this kind of very cosmopolitan engagement with ballet, people who simply do it for fun, right? They do it to stay fit, they do it to exercise. You have this very different group of people who seek out spaces that are away from the gaze of urban residents and tourists and people who would have a different type of reaction to the aesthetics of the space, right? So that rural kind of bushland, wooded aesthetic that I think has an affective impact on people's sensibilities while they're engaged in the dance, because I think it does conjure up some nostalgia, right, of the kind of ancestral past, but it also gives them an opportunity to engage in a different kind of temporality where they're saying the future generation of Martinicans can now come to spaces like this, right? They don't have to rely on kind of the urban ballet schools that have emerged as a way of, widely diffusing the dance and transmitting the dance. They can come to spaces like this and really feel connected to the natural energies around them. And it's really interesting discourses thinking about the past and then Martinique futurity, right? The person I interviewed who owned that space said, I'm happy for what the revivalists did. They urbanized the dance, they opened associations, they standardized a ballet pedagogy by developing a codification system of the dance movements. It's like, but now there's a third wave of ballet practitioners that are going to carry us forward, and there's a desire to return to the woods, right? He keeps saying ballet is practiced en bas bois, meaning under the woods, in the woods, right? And so he's saying there needs to be a return to that. There's an increasing desire for connecting to the dance in that way. Very long response. Hope that answered your question. Anything else?
I think that's been
I don't know if we went over time.